Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. I'm joined today with my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to be talking through some of this week's news stories. So just for those who don't know, Digital Law is a niche law firm based here in the UK, and we specialise in online data protection and cyber law as well. So I'll just pass over to Peter just to give himself a little introduction before we get started.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, so Digital Law is a firm where we handle everything from data protection, cybersecurity, and e-commerce, everything online. And as you can imagine, we are continuing to be pretty busy during this time when even more business is being handled online in a digital manner, and wanted to share some of the insights that we've had with our audience from looking at some of the main news stories that have been publicised this week. So I'll take it away, please, Laura.
Thank you. So the first story this week is in regards to Facebook and a class action that has been brought against them. So Facebook is being sued by UK users over claims that he has failed to protect their personal data by allowing a third-party app to harvest their data without their consent. So this is a mass legal action that's been launched here in the UK, and they're using saying that basically Facebook has collected all this data without their consent. It's been filed with the High Court in London, and the failings that have taken place were between November 2013 and May 2015. So I think it's important to note that this is obviously before GDPR. So the old Data Protection Act, the Data Protection Act 1998, will apply to this and not GDPR itself. And I think it's important to note as well that this is obviously a class action, so an action by individuals, by the users of the site rather than the regulator itself.
Yes, indeed. Those are indeed, I think, the main highlights there, Laura, and thank you for pointing them out, because I think it's also key to bear in mind this is a third-party developer. So there are an awful lot of developers who use the Facebook platform to then create their own apps which operate within that environment. So it's not Facebook that's being sued, it's not the Facebook app, it's a third-party app on Facebook. But nonetheless, they have been clearly engaged in farming a significant amount of personal data and doing it without consent. And this is just, I suppose, a little thing to bear in mind as well, that I think an awful lot of people associate consent and the handling of data solely with GDPR. And of course, that forgets the fact that, consent was a major issue under the old data protection regime as well. So the old Data Protection Directive in Europe from 1995 and the Data Protection Act 1998 in the UK, and therefore it is still a breach of the law to be not handling users' data correctly without the right consent, and that's what this litigation would potentially prove.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to mention as well that class actions like this are becoming increasingly popular, if that's the correct word. But like I was saying to Peter just before this call, there's the Ticketmaster class action. There's many other class actions that it seems to be a new way forward in terms of people trying to get compensation under GDPR, and obviously in this case under the old legislation as well.
Yes, indeed. So I think it's BA, Marriott, Oracle, Salesforce. There are multiple class actions taking place there because of the massive scale of those data protection breaches. But it is interesting to see it being applied in this instance with this this much older breach, though certainly it stands to have affected a fairly large number of people, and that's why we're looking at this class action having been started in the High Court in London. It will be interesting to see as well whether the UK becomes a bit of a a centre for being able to actually issue these class actions, bearing in mind our jurisdiction, bearing in mind a lot of the big corporations are based in the UK, or very often they use terms where they use the UK, law of England and Wales, I should say, as their sort of jurisdiction of choice within their terms, means that it's quite likely, I think, we'll still have a lot of those class actions taking place in England and Wales, as opposed to certainly other jurisdictions in Europe, for example. So I can still see that being the case, because other jurisdictions, for example, you're looking at state or federal level in Germany or in France and other countries, and there really isn't the scale of the sort of size of jurisdiction and plus the quality of the courts in London. So I can see the courts of England and Wales based in London continuing to be responsible for the hosting of these sorts of class actions, and then producing the decisions that others will then seek to rely on.
Absolutely. So moving on to our next story today then. So this is in relation to the EU and following Australia in making Google pay for news. So this is a story that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. It might have even been last week. And this is about the Australia bringing in new legislation, which will mean that Google have to pay, Google and other platforms such as like Facebook and things will have to pay for the news to be displayed on their site. So by the looks of things, the EU is in talks or could be following Australia in this and bringing in similar legislation in line with Australia's plans as well. So Google did threaten to block the search engine in Australia. So that could be a threat to the EU if that does take place, if we do follow the same, well, if the EU do follow the same line. And it's the whole reason for this is to, in a move to challenge the dominance of US interest, search and social media platforms. So it's basically just to like tighten down on the restrictions that are on in place over these platforms.
Indeed, thanks, Laura. And it's an interesting evolution of the story we originally covered in Australia on a previous edition, and the fact that now Europe could be going down the same path shows the difficult place that Google and other platforms are gradually going to find themselves in, where they're sharing others' content and potentially being required to pay to do so. Because of course, very often it's the content from the news sources that people recognise. Everything from the things like authorised news sources, everything from the BBC to the Times, to the Guardian, to other recognised news sources. People are increasingly wanting to rely on these news sources, and therefore it looks like there could be the case where they end up having to pay a real premium to do so. And it's one thing to turn around and for Google to have threatened to pull out of the Australian market, which, while important globally, is one of the smaller markets in comparison to, say, Europe, India, or the United States. To then find that there could be similar pressures in Europe does raise an interesting problem. I mean, let's bear this in context as well with the new Digital Services Act package in Europe that is under negotiation and will be coming in the coming months. This means that the hurdles that Google, Facebook, and others are having to clear in order to be able to operate their services in Europe are going to be increasingly higher. And there does come a certain tipping point where the EU might find that the regulations it is seeking to impose and the requirements it's putting on organisations makes them make an awkward decision. That decision is, can we afford to invest in complying with the restrictions that you are wishing to impose, or should we just pull out of operating in your jurisdiction? And the gamble that the EU makes is to say, well, look, we've got over 300 million citizens here, high net worth individuals. It is therefore worth you paying the price that we impose through our regulation in order to end up accessing our market. And at a certain point, regrettably, and I get the point that these global corporations might start to look and say, well, is it really worth it? So there are 7 billion people in the earth, and while they don't all have internet access, increasingly those in other markets from India to the Far East, to the Middle East, to Africa, do have access, and they can be accessed without having to jump through these increasingly steep hurdles that are being placed in the way. So there may come a tipping point. Will this be it? I doubt it, but this is the sabre that is continuing to be battled, that we will pull out if this measure comes in. Let's bear in mind as well that famously with EU measures as well, they are introduced in a way that sometimes is a bit radical, so they can then be watered down, so that they then become acceptable both to the corporations and to the EU member states. So what's being proposed now is unlikely to actually become law in due course.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this will be an interesting one to follow. Just like many of the other stories we mentioned, to see if anything does actually come from this, whether Australia do implement it and whether the EU do follow in the footsteps.
Indeed, and I think actually in that comparison, funny enough, I think it's Australia where something will happen first. It's that smaller market, and it's almost like you can imagine that the platforms might think, well, let's make Australia the test case. If we do pull out from the Australian market, then it's look, we're serious. We did pull out, even though in terms of their business, Australia is a much smaller market on its own. If it was Australia and several other countries, then that would get quite interesting, I think, to see if that would be more of an acid test. But let's see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next one then. So quite a scary story in the terms of things. So this one is regarding to a hacker that tried to poison the water supply in a city in Florida. So a computer hacker actually gained access to the water system in a city in Florida and tried to pump in a dangerous amount of chemicals. So the hacker actually briefly increased the amount of sodium hydroxide, which is already in the city's water, to try and get rid of some of the acidity of the water. But they tried to pump in a dangerous amount. So luckily a worker spotted this before anything seriously happened, and the action was reversed. And the mayor has then gone and confirmed that there is a bad actor out there who is trying to do these things. So I think it's worth mentioning they did see that somebody tried to get into the system, which wasn't recognised, but the worker initially thought that this was just one of the supervisors who was trying to get in. So it's lucky that this was spotted. But I think it's important to know here that a lot of people, and even us sometimes, we think that the hackers are out there, they're trying to get money, trying to cause loss in terms of data and things like that, when really their true aim is just to cause disruption. They might have done this just to cover the steps in terms of like doing something else in the long run. So a lot more serious things can happen from these hacks. We just don't see them as often as we do trying to steal data and money.
Indeed, and this is showing the real world consequences of a cyber attack, and it is an illustration of the fact that all networks are now online, from the water to the sewage to numerous services that we rely on in industrialized nations for our continued operation and survival. I think COVID's been a bit of a wake-up call in the last year, because it's shown, look how dangerous things can get, even if food supply is restricted. So think of the empty shelves that we've had at times during the lockdowns, and the panic that tends to build rather quickly when that happens. Now imagine if the electricity supply goes off in a city for 24 hours. That's been a big story in America at times in the last few years. Imagine if electricity went offline for a month. Imagine if it was disconnected for a period of many months because the network was knocked out permanently and had to then be rebuilt from scratch. Imagine the services that couldn't then be delivered because there was no power. And this is unfortunately now a reality. There has been an arms race in recent years where, alongside the nuclear weapons, which are horrific and bad enough, governments have invested in the capability to be able to take out other governments' infrastructure, from electricity to the water to other crucial systems. And in the same way that sort of mutually assured destruction ensured that no one ever sort of pressed the button on the nuclear trigger, we hope that no one would ever take this step to actually end up potentially wiping out the infrastructure of another country. The idea being, well, if your infrastructure is wiped out, you'll be much easier to potentially conquer. But these are the sorts of weapons that countries have developed. But countries have developed them, and so have individuals. And it's a scary thought to think, God, what if someone goes and does this and then says blackmails a city or a country into paying a ransom, so that the water supply, for example, isn't then contaminated and ruined. And this is, we haven't heard so much about these sorts of attacks, but if anyone's interested, I'd say to Google the Stuxnet attack, S-T-U-X-N-E-T, and that was a cyber attack on a nuclear plant in the Middle East, in Iran, carried out by the US government. And that showed how you actually cause a lot of damage to a nuclear reactor, a nuclear reprocessing plant, without launching an airstrike. You just simply did it through a cyber attack. And that was even on an air-gapped network. And there are several quite interesting documentaries online you can watch to learn from that. But it could happen to a nuclear power station, and as we can see here, it can happen to a water supply as well. This is the reason why we did this story in the middle of this week's update, because it's actually quite scary, and we thought it wasn't a particularly nice one to finish on. But I think it's one that we all need to think about quite carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important one to cover. I know it's not going to be one that happens over and over again. It won't be one that we're obviously cover every week like some of the attacks that we see. But it's just an important one to mention because of the seriousness of it. So moving on to the next story then, this is in regards to the EPrivacy rules that were proposed, that were supposed to come in at the same time as GDPR. So this is the updated EPrivacy directive. On the 10th of February, member states actually agreed on a negotiating mandate for the revised rules on the protection of privacy and confidentiality in terms of the use of electronic communication services. So an update to the existing EPrivacy directive is needed in order to cater for the new technological and market developments, such as the widespread use of voice IP, web-based email, messaging service, the emergence of new technologies and techniques for tracking users' online behaviour. So the new draft EPrivacy regulation will be repealed when the EPrivacy directive comes into place. But whenever that does come in place, we do not know.
Indeed, thanks, Phil. I think it's a really important story to track this, because the EPrivacy regulation has been, GDPR's stillborn next of kin, really. It was supposed to have come in at the same time as GDPR. It didn't do so. It carries the same fines matrix, so you can, in theory, have these very large fines as well. It's not just limited to data protection, it's all electronic online communication, so everything from WhatsApp to Facebook Messenger, LinkedIn Messenger, Telegram, all these other apps. The idea is it's looking at those as well as voice over internet protocol phone calls. And that, of course, is how the majority of digital phone systems now operate, as well as voicemail. So this has massive reach, this legislation. It has been incredibly contentious in terms of lobbying from nation states and corporations. It also includes things like the operation of cookies. That was originally included in the original EPrivacy directive. This draft regulation originally was published a few years ago and was still bubbling around in 2018. And I heard an MEP giving a speech on it at the time saying how important this was. But then it went into something called the trilogue, which is a mechanism between the Council, Parliament and the EU Commission to try and find a way forward. And lo and behold, it's gone through that. It's now come out the other side, and they are hoping that this now is a text that can be agreed and can get through the European Parliament. But I saw that this news was a bit of fanfare on LinkedIn. Lots of people saying, wow, this is really, really big. Here it is. But let's just see if this is indeed the final text, or if there ends up still being further revision having to be made to it. And let's see what the response is from some of the corporations that this seeks to regulate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if this was supposed to come in to force in 2018 when GDPR came in, I wouldn't be surprised if there is further delays for it. So it'll be interesting to see when it does finally come into play and what restrictions it imposes as well.
Indeed, and I think the text has been watered down quite a bit from what was originally proposed in 2018. And let's just see if this now works, because just because the Parliament and the Council and the Commission think, oh, this will all work, doesn't necessarily mean that it will now properly pass the test with national governments. Okay, the European Council, which involves the heads of state, has been looking at it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be happy with it and everyone will then give it the weight for it to go ahead. It will also rely on, of course, the rotating EU presidency to get the support of the country holding that presidency to actually get it through. So, indeed, watch this space. Is the version that we see in front of us now actually going to become law? Still a little bit of time to confirm that, yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. So moving on to our next story then. So this story is in regards to hacked messages and their use as evidence in court. So this case comes and basically the decision from this case has decided that intercepts from encrypted messaging services used by criminals are now admissible in court. So there was a case over this that was trying to get some messages that were going to be used that had been kind of hacked into. They was trying to get that repealed and not to be used as evidence, but the judge actually rejected their bid and have now said that this type of evidence can be used. So this decision was made by the Court of Appeal, and it was in relation to some evidence that was found by the French police. After just doing some digging about this, I couldn't actually find whether this was a UK case or a European case, so maybe we'll cover that in an additional episode or something. But a lot of defence lawyers in the UK are now saying that this could create ambiguity over the means of terms used in English law and opens the door to allow evidence that would normally be excluded to actually be used as well.
Thanks, Laura. I mean, this is a fascinating case because it potentially has such massive implications if we think about it. Suddenly evidence that, you know, a partner might get from a partner's phone or mobile device, that could suddenly be used in family proceedings, care proceedings. You could have evidence on devices that has been obtained by a third-party hacker, but ends up being crucial in a criminal matter. Suddenly can be used without problem. So it changes things a lot there. But I almost feel it's inevitable when you think about the sheer volume of data that's out there now. I mean, how do you necessarily define hacked when we have messages that are going back and forth, stored on the cloud, or encrypted on devices? Such a large part of our lives increasingly are now lived on these devices, particularly, I hate to say it again, COVID during the last year. We're relying on digital networks to communicate and to work and to live. So you almost feel that this decision reflects the fact that an awful lot of evidence will be in that format. Therefore, in order to get all the evidence that a court might need to make a clear decision, suggests that it's therefore worth allowing that evidence to be admissible. And it's interesting that this is an appeal court decision, so it's senior judges that have made this decision. And it will have, I think, significant implications going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main point of this is that there is going to be that mass ambiguity about it. Like you said, how do you interpret hacked? Like, what does come under what is classified as a message being hacked? So I think in order to clarify it, there's going to have to be more cases in the future to be able to obviously apply it to the law better.
Yes.
So moving on to our last story then. So this is in regards to the Metropolitan Police and their scanning of 13,000 faces in order to catch one suspect. So this is using the facial technology recognition technology, and basically the police have been compiling lists of people who they were wanting to arrest of offenders, and then setting up cameras in specific areas to be able to then scan people's faces. So this technology alerts officers of a potential match of their offender, and then they have the opportunity to make an arrest if they think it's appropriate. So I think it is important to note that this biometric surveillance is actually wrong as much as 7 out of 8 occasions. So for this reason, I think privacy campaigners are saying that this is an intrusion, and it's too great to be used on a regular basis, given the low success rate with this technology.
Thanks, Laura. I think this is a fascinating story because this technology is probably the future when it comes to providing the police with ID evidence to be able to place someone, say, at a demonstration or at a certain place at a certain time. Even if that evidence is actually then to say exonerate someone, well, they couldn't have been committing the crime because we have them on this CCTV outside this station at such and such a time, a long distance away, so therefore it couldn't be them. But if you're going to seek to rely on that, it is currently problematic when, as you say, the high incidence of this biometric identification via CCTV footage being found to be fallible. It sounds convincing to say, oh, we've gone through all of these images and we can confirm it's this person. And when you've got data behind it and it's a scientist saying that does sound very convincing. But a bit like when in the early days of forensic evidence, just because the forensic scientist stands up and says, oh, this is incontrovertible evidence, doesn't necessarily mean in the cold light of day that it is necessarily absolute fact, as was sadly caused when we found that there were different convictions over using forensic evidence that were not able to hold weight ultimately. And it could be the case with ID convictions under the current technology. But I hasten to add that as the technology improves, as processing power improves, as the software gets better, this form of identification is probably the future, and it'll become much more accurate than it currently is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in its current state and the capabilities it's got right now, it's not really ideal, and you can see why the privacy campaigners have obviously got these concerns. But like you said, as the technology develops over time, it'll just get better and better, and it may become a popular tool for the police to use in the future.
Indeed, and I've heard in this article, Silky Carlo from Big Brother Watch is quoted, and I've met and spoken at conferences alongside Silky on several occasions. She really knows her stuff on these issues, and I think she is quite right to be raising the concerns with regards to both the fallibility of these systems and also the sheer invasion of privacy. The fact that this technology is picking you up when you're walking through, and let's face it, some UK cities with some of the densest CCTV of any country in the world. So the fact that that could be then used for these purposes is a significant infringement on civil liberties. I think it's a step that we do need to be mindful of and careful of. Arguably, I think there needs to be a greater awareness amongst the public and a bit of a public debate in terms of how far do we want these powers to go. I mean, it's a convincing argument to say use the data and keep us safe. Mm-hmm. But at what cost? And I hasten to add again, course of the last year, we've lost quite a few of our liberties, which we hope we'll get back at some point in the near future, like COVID. But you tend to think, will we then, when we can, start mixing again, travel, go to rock concerts, eat at restaurants, all these sorts of things are where you are in groups and subject to this sort of surveillance. And is this going to be widespread? And I think this is something that needs greater awareness amongst the public, so we can think about this and decide how we want this technology to be used, rather than it just happening without that sort of public awareness by the back door.
Yeah, completely. Thank you for summing that one up. So just as a reminder for all our listeners, so that's everything we've got time for today. But just as a reminder, we have still got the offer on for our GDPR compliance manual for legal practices. So this is a manual for legal practices in terms of GDPR, but we have had some feedback from some of the people who purchased this in other professional fields, such as accountants and financial services, and they have found it is useful as well. So this is down from £195 with about 50% off, and it is now on sale for £99. So I'll just pass over to Peter just to give you a little bit more information about this.
So here it is, forms and templates and checklists to help you with being able to work out how your organisation can comply with GDPR. It all comes down to demonstrating compliance to the regulator. We show you how to compile the records, how to get the policies in place, where the risk points are. And we're looking not just at the world digitally in terms of your computer systems and your information and your social media. We look at your communications. We look at the physical office space as well. So how you're handling data around the office, how your staff are handling it. And we even have a lengthy section in there on home working and remote working. So we were ahead of the curve with all of that. So all of the information is in here to help you get a handle on risk and complying properly with data protection legislation. When it comes to operating your business, large and small.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So thank you once again for listening to this week's episode. Just as a reminder, these are weekly episodes that are uploaded usually on a Tuesday, and they are available to view on demand via our YouTube channel, our website, and podcast channels as well. So thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us produce this webinar, and we hope to see you all next week. Thank you for listening.